I recently made an anime review so bad that I couldn't release it because I knew at least some people who knew me would watch it and I'd have to explain it to them. Berserk of Gluttony is one of my many white whales, a story which I have tried and failed to dissect on several occasions, but which I just wasn't a strong enough reviewer to ever properly analyze to an extent I was happy with, and so I have like 3 scrapped videos on it, including one that just recently I basically spent an entire semester making. It's almost done. There are like 5 unedited minutes of it on the timeline, and I just cannot release it because it's garbage. What I made wasn't an overall review of Berserk of Gluttony, and instead focuses on what is probably a minority of what makes it what it is, both in terms of percentage length and substance. All of my complaints are even more personal than most reviews are. It put more of myself onto the table than is normal even in my videos, and thus I felt this need to over-explain everything, to the point that I started repeating examples and making myself look like my positions weren't actually supported by the text. I was trying to convey what it felt like to sit through a small but meaningful portion of this anime and how that affected the rest of my experience watching it. An emotional truth of mine rather than a dry analysis of the text's core components. And I just wasn't aware that that was what I was making when I was first laying out the script. Berserk of Gluttony is about... it's more of a setup than an actual plot. You have the protagonist who is living in a lit RPG fantasy world, so leveling up, experience points, the concept of skills and stats, these are all a part of the setting, and the hero has a skill called Gluttony, which gives him a hunger for killing, but which also allows him to absorb the strength of enemies he defeats. If that sounds interesting, like this whole idea of him thirsting for blood when he's the protagonist, I should add that he can just kill goblins to sate his hunger, and according to the internal morality of the story, you don't have any reason to mourn their deaths. They're monsters in a JRPG. He's grinding. Beyond that, there are things that happen. You can charitably call it an Odyssey story. There are characters with different sin powers. There's a lust and a sloth, and the protagonist, whose name is literally Fate Graphite, a name so funny I am ashamed I can't think of a good joke about it. He has this love interest who's going to war, and he has to go and make sure she doesn't die. It's a lot of fight scenes and subpar world building. You've been here before. You've seen stories like this. All in all, there's a sort of campy, edgy vibe that makes it unironically fun at times, and it's better produced than most light novel schlop it might remind you of, but there were 3 big things about it that I covered in my most recent attempt at dissecting it, things that just stick in my mind. First, you have the fact that the story is really, really classist, which bothers me a lot as a social work student. So the biggest thing about this happens in episode 1 and involves the main love interest, whose name is Roxy Hart, which is coincidentally also my stripper name. Roxy kills 2 thieves in cold blood extrajudicially in order to stop them from stealing from, a palace. And that character not only owns a grape plantation full of working class people whose only personality trait is loving her, not only is she depicted as being so good-natured, so beloved by the people of this world that the despair caused by her death would have supernatural consequences, but there's this weird one good apple narrative going on. The story is full of evil authority figures that have the same station as Roxy the Butcher. They're called Holy Knights, and they're kind of a mix between nobles, military, and domestic police. And they get shown doing basically nothing but oppressing people, and the story's thesis is that the world would be better if all of these assholes were like Roxy instead. It's very explicitly pro-hierarchy. It takes as assumed that there should be a caste of ultra-powerful people, and then a bunch of poor people who are beholden to that upper echelon, despite the fact that a huge amount of the conflict in this story comes from that higher echelon abusing its power. It does this thing where it selectively takes wealth and opulence as synonymous with purity and prosperity. Like, there's this old rich guy whose home was taken over by a lich, and the hero has to help delve into the undead-infested mansion to defeat said lich with him. The bad guy creates an illusion of his old life to mess with him. He has a tearful reunion with this illusion of his wife and son, and then there's also like a dozen servants in the background welcoming him back, which draw no emotions out of him. They are unnamed set dressing to this guy and his direct family, who actually matter. And meanwhile, the protagonist, who is a peasant and was dealing with malignant authority figures for his entire backstory, is just standing right there with no thoughts on the matter. There's also a lot of essentialism, not racism, assuming you don't count all the monsters, but it's just really convinced that people's worth is determined by their inherent qualities. That if someone fails to rise out of poverty, it's because they were not born worthy of wealth. It's imposing meritocracy not as a value to strive for, but as a force of nature, survival of the fittest, which carries moral weight itself. The hero is in such severe poverty in such a dystopian society that he's probably going to die from the vulnerability he suffers, but he personally lays the blame on his own lack of ability, thinking that if he were born more talented, he would deserve more, but that currently he does not. And we're meant to realize he's destined for greatness when we discover he was born with a broken superpower. It's all just really clumsy and poorly thought out. And that takes us to the second and third problems that I wanted to discuss. The second point of that video I scrapped is that the romantic subplot is bad, like, shockingly bad. It is hitting all of the notes that I normally want my romantic subplots in action stories to hit, but it's just so lifeless and boring somehow, which is because of the third point of my video. The laziness that went into the ideological and thematic aspects of this story are not separate from the laziness that made the love story unengaging. Bad ideas lead to bad art. There's this scene where Fate and Foxy, if you will, are watching some asshole holy knights abuse a child in the streets. Now, the story at the start is very explicitly about this power dynamic, the one between holy knights and the impoverished masses, and so you think something would be done with this, like narratively. It could make for a great scene. Roxy is herself a holy knight, and so if any questions were asked about, for example, if the holy knights even should exist, or if they should have this much power, that implicates her. It's easy to imagine a scene where Roxy apologizes for being complicit in this system, which you could take in a number of directions. Maybe Fate tells her that she shouldn't apologize because it's not her fault, or maybe this causes her to develop into someone more critical of her own society, which then helps her better empathize with her commoner love interest. But none of that can happen because the story thinks that these guys having power over this kid is the way the world should work. Like, the story doesn't think that these specific people should be in power, but that's as far as it goes. It is pro-hierarchy, pro-elites ruling over the masses, and thus the only problem it sees are that these three have rotten personalities. And so, what even is there to do that has any emotional relevancy to the protagonists? It tries, but it's just so flaccid and difficult to buy that the scene accomplishes nothing. The story's ideology is explicitly rooted in its lack of interest in thinking about the very topics it intends to comment on. And so a huge amount of what's on screen is just lifeless and incapable of adding to the story in a meaningful way. If they had put thought into the topic of power and hierarchy, they would have something to say that would be interesting, but they don't have that, which is why it expresses the beliefs that it does. And all of this is why the romantic subplot is so bad, and why so much of the plot is unengaging, because most stories, most competent stories, without us even realizing, does things to make us care, and that part was just wasted in this story on ideas that were completely hollow. That's what I was going to spend over half an hour talking about, just what I covered in about 5 minutes just now. I need to change my approach to video making, I think. I want to focus on smaller projects. And for these huge videos I'm making, like the one on Darling in the Franxx, which still isn't close to being in a releasable state, I mean, I do want to finish that. I want to make a version that I can release, but with my current method, I'm just dragging on. I want to shift towards more focused critique that doesn't belabor every detail in an attempt to be understood, and hopefully that will lead to me not having 5 mental breakdowns every time I do a video larger than 10 minutes. As always, I want to ask that you guys like, and if you're not already subscribed, subscribe, and also make sure to comment. That kind of thing not only makes me want to keep making these videos, because I love seeing the little guys, like, comment stuff, but it also does just incredible things for getting this video into the algorithm. I asked you guys to comment and like for the sake of me releasing later videos on the same topic, and those videos did so much better than I otherwise would have expected them to. So yeah, please do that. And as always, I'd like to thank my wonderful patrons, of whom we have a new member. And as always, I also want to thank my Tier 2 patrons, especially Bellman, Carolyn Vig, and Love Your Content. As always, thanks for watching, and if you want to support me, my Patreon is linked in the description. Bye!